You know a shrike is a bird, often called a butcher bird. It has the nasty habit of impaling its prey on thorns. That's what I'm going to do. Impale them on the thorns of justice. Or failing that, destroy them. So let me put it bluntly. Will you join me in my quest for revenge and justice?
Chronomaster is a point-and-click sci-fi adventure game developed by Dreamforge Entertainment and published by Capstone Software in December 1995. Players control Rene Corder, accomplished polymath and private eye, and his spunky AI partner Jester as they hunt for an intergalactic terrorist. This faceless menace is chrono-freezing the rich and famous in their own artificial pocket universes, and the only way to free them is to uncover the corrupted world keys hidden within. But Corder will need more than his wits to liberate these worlds. Bottled time, magic wands, interdimensional probability devices, and a good old sonic screwdriver are among the tools Corder has to put to use to foil his nemesis. Officially, Chronomaster was marketed as being the final work written by famed sci-fi author Roger Zelazny, with assistance from his partner Jane Lindskold. In truth, Zelazny was only responsible for the basic outline and some preliminary ideas before he passed away in 1995. According to Lindskold, who was actually responsible for the bulk of the writing, Zelazny had been fascinated by computer games as a new medium for storytelling, having previously contributed to a 1985 adaptation of his famous Chronicles of Amber series. Lindskold had expected to be sidelined from the project after Zelazny's death, but Dreamforge Entertainment instead invited her to take a greater role in Chronomaster, making her both lead writer and one of the puzzle designers. Lindskold hoped to honour Zelazny by incorporating those elements of computer games he had previously expressed interest in, like branching narratives and multiple endings. At the time, Dreamforge Entertainment were best known for role-playing games and dungeon crawlers, like Veil of Darkness, Dungeon Hack, and Menzoberranzan. Though it seemed odd for the company to suddenly jump into the point-and-click genre, some of their designers did have experience creating puzzles from these earlier titles. It was hoped that the game could be the basis for a whole new franchise, and Lindskold was commissioned to write a tie-in novel that would be the first of a whole series of stories set in the Chronomaster universe. Chronomaster's release was met with pretty positive reviews. Computer Gaming World lauded the game's voice acting and pre-rendered graphics, but gave particular credit to Dreamforge's puzzle designers for incorporating the concept of bottled time into gameplay, calling it a real throwback, in the best way, to how games used to be, when designers used to evoke the great works of science fiction and fantasy. Next Generation magazine were also impressed by the game, giving it 4 stars and singling out its intuitive and accessible interface design. PC Zone's review was one of the few negative ones, relegating Chronomaster to its back-page review section for being an old-school adventure with old-school puzzles, calling it dull, slow-paced, and straight out of 1993. Unfortunately, Chronomaster's mostly positive reception didn't translate to commercial success, and Capstone Software's parent company went bankrupt in 1996, leaving the game without a publisher. Although Jane Lindskold's tie-in novel was released, its sequels were cancelled and the Chronomaster franchise passed into legal oblivion. Computer Gaming World would later cite the game's failure as part of a broader trend in science fiction, arguing that the genre was transitioning from the literature of ideas to intellectual fast food. Zooming spaceships sell, Charles R. Dye observed, but science fiction itself doesn't. Chronomaster wasn't the end for Dreamforge Entertainment, who hung on for several years and released several other well-received titles, including cult classic Sanitarium in 1998. Unfortunately, the company suffered a series of setbacks in the early 2000s, such as the cancellation of a Werewolf the Apocalypse tie-in, and closed their doors in 2001. In Chronomaster, the player's objective is to guide René Korda to 7 pocket universes, and then access their world keys, which govern the laws of physics and nature in said universes. Korda can then reprogram the world key, release the pocket dimension from stasis, hop back in his ship, and jump to the next pocket universe. The problem is that the location of these world keys is usually hidden, and each pocket universe usually features multiple locations to explore, so you can't just bumble around hoping to find the world key at random. Each time he enters a new pocket dimension, Korda's priority is to travel to its magnetic north and set up a resonance tracer, which can then tell Korda's direction finder the rough location of the world key. But of course, things are never simple. The specific spot Korda needs to set up his resonance tracer is usually inaccessible or blocked by something, and this is where the various layers of puzzle solving come in. On its face, Chronomaster uses a pretty standard point-and-click control scheme with a verb-based command system. Korda can look at points of interest, pick things up, push or pull objects, open or close doors and containers, talk to NPCs, use items in his inventory on other items, and all the usual stuff. But there are various mechanics on top of this. First, there's Korda's PDA, which can be used to connect to his ship's AI, Jester, who can then pull up the ship's database or interface with certain electronic devices in the game world. Then, there's Korda's Universal Tool. This has 3 functions, the first 2 being a screwdriver and hammer, and the third of which can vary depending on the pocket universe Korda is currently exploring. On the militaristic sci-fi world of Herbs, it's a force rod, but in the fantastical fey forests of Cabal, it's a magic wand. And on top of all this, there's time itself. Since each pocket universe is frozen in stasis, Korda is only able to go about his business because he is wrapped in a force field that lets time behave normally in his immediate vicinity. This is both a blessing and a curse for Korda, as his mere presence can reactivate dormant security systems or hungry monsters. And of course various NPCs and devices will only act normally when Korda is right next to them. Korda can try and work around the latter problem by using his finite supply of bottled time, which could, for example, have value to NPCs who are open to bartering. Chronomaster isn't shy about making the player use multiple puzzle-solving mechanics at once. Using the verb-based commands in conjunction with combining items, the PDA, the Universal Tool, and bottled time for a single puzzle isn't out of the question. Mercifully, pocket universes are self-contained, so you don't have to worry about some random item you picked up in the Dwarfen Mines being critical to a puzzle on a space station, but even then, a single puzzle could easily be spread across multiple locations, even multiple planets, within a single pocket universe. So far, Chronomaster sounds like a fairly typical point-and-click adventure, albeit with a lot more mechanics to consider than was standard for the genre. But there's another twist on the formula, because progress in each pocket universe was designed to facilitate a good degree of non-linear puzzle solving. That is to say that there are actually several ways to bypass obstacles or fulfill your goals in Chronomaster. So you might strike a deal with an NPC, cheat them with a forgery, or bypass them entirely and find a completely different solution. There are some challenges that will always be completed the same way, the final puzzles for unlocking the world keys for example, but most of the time your inventory will be stuffed with bizarre contraptions you might never make use of. The final mechanic worth noting is the addition of a sidekick about halfway through the game. Most of the time, Corder's new friend is off dealing with his own mission, and the two can sometimes contact each other to exchange tips, but there are a few cases in which they'll have to collaborate on a more immediate challenge. So, whilst an experienced point-and-click player will cotton on to the basics of the gameplay fairly quickly, there are a few novel ideas for them to grapple with before they can master the game. As for my experience with the game, I thought it was interesting. Most old reviews described Chronomaster's puzzles as being of an intermediate level of difficulty by the standards of the time, but for the average player today, especially someone like me who doesn't play adventure games very often, that means they can be pretty damn tough. The part that nearly did me in was a light and sound memory game halfway through. I'm really bad at these kind of things. I have a low attention span and I get frustrated very easily, so I nearly gave up on the game here. Now, some of the more relaxing puzzles I really enjoyed, checking out all the different locations for clues, inspecting the items, trying to figure out some of the more ingenious mechanics. Looking at the expanded interface in Chronomaster, you'd be forgiven for feeling overwhelmed. When you present the player with so many different mechanics, there's generally two possible outcomes. Either interacting with the world feels too obtuse, or interacting with the world feels more interesting because there's so much to experiment with. Luckily, I think Chronomaster falls into the latter category. Chronomaster mixes things up enough that each time you move to a new universe, you can just faintly sense the old grey matter starting to warm up again. It feels nice to have to sit back and think about how to tie all the different elements together, rather than the brainless monkey see, monkey do of many modern adventure games. But even in these more pleasant moments, particularly convoluted puzzles can grate a bit. There were a couple of times I had to look up a guide, and even in retrospect, I don't really understand the logic behind some of the solutions. In a couple of parts, I felt like the dialogue was deliberately misleading, implying I shouldn't try what turned out to be the correct option, and either wasting my time or causing a game over. Also, Chronomaster doesn't really try to mitigate the problem of heavy backtracking. In the casino world, going in and out and up and down the elevator can be quite an annoyance when you need to make multiple trips between points of interest, and navigating the instant death traps every time you wanted to backtrack in parts of the desert world wasn't much fun either. I noticed that several reviews, both old and new, took issue with that desert world. A common complaint was that the puzzles in the first Pocket universe, the sci-fi world of Herbs, were generally quite logical, but once you reached the fantastical deserts of Orans, that all went out the window. Personally, I don't know if that's a fair criticism. Herbs seemed more compartmentalized to me, like it was deliberately built as a tutorial world, and they didn't want players wandering off before they understood the basic mechanics. Whereas Orans was meant to be your first real challenge. I don't know if the puzzles in Orans were less logical, so much as clues were a bit more spread out than on Herbs, so it was harder to immediately put the solutions together in your head. I did read a lot of comments from people saying they played Chronomaster when they were younger but got stuck somewhere after the first Pocket universe and never finished the game. Ironically, I think one cause of this might have been the non-linear progression. Since there are multiple solutions to problems in Chronomaster, and each route could in itself be a very lengthy process, it's possible to waste a huge chunk of your time busying yourself with a puzzle that's completely redundant because you'd already completed another puzzle. I'm sure the intent was to solve the common adventure game problem of players getting completely stuck in a tough puzzle and not being able to progress at all. But rather than make the game more accessible, the way multiple solutions was implemented leads to players potentially getting even more annoyed because they waste time on multiple unfinished puzzles that all lead to the same thing. The final unique gimmick I mentioned earlier was the addition of a flesh and blood partner halfway through the game. This doesn't amount to much, as it won't substantially influence how you play the game, other than encouraging you to check your ship's computer a bit more often. I suspect this mechanic, if you can even call it that, was either meant as a throwaway idea that sounded cool but didn't get much thought put into it, or it's only there for story-related reasons. So I'd say Chronomaster is a game designed for people who are already pretty comfortable with classic point-and-click titles of the early 90s. It doesn't do much to make the experience more accessible or rewarding for casual players. Instead, it tries to build on top of conventional point-and-click gameplay to enhance the existing mechanics, and give fans who already like this kind of thing a little bit more to chew on. The 7 pocket universes of Chronomaster are reflections of their owners' personal tastes, so it's not surprising there's often a deliberate lack of consistency in art direction from one universe to the next. One minute René Corder might be walking around the cover of a 1970s sci-fi novel, the next he's chilling with the fairies. This juxtaposition of realism and ridiculousness could be a deal breaker for some players. Verisimilitude is obviously a very important part of being immersed in the game world, and there are certainly people who might find it difficult to get immersed in a setting that hops from spaceships to witches to moon men and talking corn.
Corn? Corn indeed. I am maize.
Even in the more plausible environments, technical limitations can be a burden. Some of the worlds don't look like they were fully realized before Corder stepped into them. The casino world of Fortuna is supposed to be an intergalactic hub bustling with activity, but NPCs in Chronomaster are normally immobile, so you'll walk into a giant gambling hall that seems totally empty, then move one screen over and suddenly encounter a whole crowd of people you had no inkling were there. In large scenes like this, only a very small number of background assets can be animated at once, so you kind of feel like you've walked into a cartoon that hasn't been animated yet. Now, the game does try to justify this with in-universe logic, since some of these pocket universes are frozen in time, and it's not always clear whether the inhabitants of certain worlds are meant to be real people or artificial humans. But this excuse doesn't really hold up, as you can sometimes revisit locations before and after they've been frozen in stasis, and the differences usually aren't that stark. More recent reviews also commented that Chronomaster's overall graphics have held up quite poorly, especially the numerous FMV sequences that play in a little window at the center of the screen. I certainly don't blame people for being turned off by the mid-90s CGI, especially compared to some of the beautiful sprite work of the time, but for me there's a certain nostalgic quality to early 3D renders. I don't know if younger players will appreciate it, but there's a very distinct Lawnmower Man-esque look to 3D graphics of this type, and some of the wackier environments in Chronomaster definitely wouldn't look out of place on an old Tangerine Dream album. Unfortunately, audio limitations of this era aren't quite as easy to appreciate for their quaintness. You can often hear the crackle and pop characteristic of low-quality audio files, especially at the beginning and end of dialogue.
Here is the bubble one, Sir Sugarpop. Remember, no hammer ever conquered a magic bubble, but like into like merges without trouble.
This is a shame because Chronomaster splurged on the voice acting by hiring what were at the time quite notable B or C-list Hollywood stars. Ron Perlman starred as René Corder, Brent Spiner as Milo, and Lolita Davidovich as the AI Jester. A lot of reviewers praised Perlman's performance, but were unimpressed by the rest of the cast, particularly those filling in for the remaining NPCs. I have to disagree with their praise of Perlman, though. Perlman is a very talented actor, but his wry, understated delivery doesn't work with bad quality audio, meaning a lot of the subtlety is lost in translation.
I haven't seen Charlie in centuries. Yeah. Maybe I'll check with him.
I do agree that Spiner often sounded quite bored as Milo, and the only character that really stood out for me was the chirpy Jester.
Hey Sugar Pop, message incoming from the Terran Regional Representative.
In a game like this, with all the factors that limit actors from using the full range of their skills, I think exaggerated delivery usually works best. As for music, Chronomaster's score was done by Jamie McMenemy, who was the composer on most of Dreamforge Interactive's releases. There are about 40 to 60 pieces of in-game music, depending on how you define it, And just like with the art direction, it's hard to make sweeping generalizations when each planet has a completely different style. On the whole, I'd say it does the job. A couple of the jauntier tracks are quite fun to listen to, and the music that plays over the Roger Zelazny tribute is nice, but the soundtrack isn't something that really stands on its own merits outside the game. Finally, there's the issue of running Chronomaster on modern hardware. As of this review, there is no digital release of Chronomaster, and considering the probable legal headaches associated with a title made by a defunct developer, funded by a dead publisher, and licensed from two popular authors, one of them deceased, don't expect that to change. Luckily, Chronomaster is a DOS title, so getting it running on modern hardware should be as simple as running it through DOSBox or its various children. There are also several abandonware versions available online with everything already set up for you if you're not comfortable configuring stuff in DOS. I never ran into any serious issues running Chronomaster through DOSBox, aside from some cutscenes cutting between dialogue too early. I saw the same problem in all the other footage I could find on YouTube, so this is probably a bug in the original game, but it's not a big deal anyway. So if the game interests you, there are really no barriers to jumping in and trying it right now.
Mr. Corda, I know you are retired, but we need you to deal with a very sensitive, very secret matter.
Why bother me? Surely you have people on your own staff who can deal with this, whatever it is.
Chronomaster is set in the far future, where technology has progressed to the point that the wildest fantasies of science fiction have become reality. Interstellar travel, cybernetics, mass terraforming, and the creation of artificial pocket universes are as mundane as automobiles and elevators. Thanks to advances in medicine, wealthy citizens have access to treatments that can extend their lives for hundreds of years, and talented individuals can become experts in a wide range of specialized fields. Rene Corder is one such individual, a private eye considered top of his field in a variety of professions, who has recently retired to a private world with his sentient starship Jester. At the start of the game, Corder is contacted by the Terran regional government with an emergency mission. Several pocket universes have been shut down, trapping their owners and hundreds of thousands of sentient beings in perpetual stasis. According to the laws of Old Terra, the regional government has no authority to interfere with these private universes, so Corder is hired to liberate their inhabitants and find out who has the means to inflict this atrocity on such a scale. Corder's diplomatic and professional contacts are no help, so he'll have to head to each universe in person and do some good old-fashioned legwork. Although many of the inhabitants of these worlds are artificial beings created to match the theme of each universe, they're just as real as Corder or any other natural life form trapped there. Any of these creatures could be Corder's ticket to the World Keys, or to his demise. As Corder investigates these worlds, he realizes that the 7 pocket universes were not targeted at random, and the owners of these worlds will go to any lengths to stop him from uncovering the secret that binds them together. It's interesting to look at how reviews of Chronomaster's writing seem to differ based on whether they were penned in 1995 or in the last 5 to 10 years. Older reviews were generally quite positive about Chronomaster's world building, whereas newer ones were much more likely to express disappointment with the more fantastical elements, calling them silly or out of place next to the hard sci-fi parts. Maybe this reflects changes in the popular view of what constitutes science fiction. I feel like the genre has become somewhat calcified in the sense that people today have very strong opinions on what counts as science fiction versus what counts as fantasy. Nowadays, we tend to associate overtly fantastical elements in sci-fi with a less serious tone, a conscious refusal to maintain the internal consistency of the setting, the domain of parody, even. This goes both ways, as it's jarring to go back to older fantasy works and see spaceships or laser guns. To explain this, it's worth keeping in mind that Chronomaster didn't begin as Chronomaster. It began as Sandow's Shadow, an unfinished Roger Zelazny story outline that was uncovered after the author's death. Sandow's shadow was originally meant to connect to Zelazny's 1969 novel Isle of the Dead, and the outline contains a number of elements that are shared across these works, like immortal worldscapers and the private realities they craft. The collected stories of Roger Zelazny quite straightforwardly states that Sandow's shadow is effectively the original outline for Chronomaster, just with different names. We could easily go off on a tangent exploring how much of Chronomaster was Zelazny, how much was Jane Lindskold, and how much was Dreamforge, but that's better left to someone more familiar with Zelazny's work. Personally, I've only finished the Amber books, so Chronomaster actually reminded me of Robert Heinlein's Number of the Beast, which had a vaguely similar conceit of starfarers exploring various worlds inspired by popular sci-fi and fantasy. The point here is that science fiction dabbling in fantasy or intertextuality wasn't always regarded as cause to dismiss it as on-serious or artistic navel-gazing. Consider how Chronomaster depicts the fairy tale world of Cabal. Avalon Greer, the sorcerer king of this pocket universe, broods atop a crystal tower, a dark symbol of invincible terror. But Greer is greatly affected by both the love of his innocent daughter and a subconscious desire to be punished for his past crimes. Greer cut out his own heart and concealed it in a minion, then imprisoned his daughter in a glass bubble and cast a spell of blissful sleep upon her. To make Greer answer for his crimes, the hero must free the heart and deliver it to the daughter, who can then transform Greer into the man he wishes to be through the act of forgiveness. This whole concept might seem bizarre for a sci-fi game, but it certainly wouldn't have been too out of place in the dreamlike artificial worlds of Isle of the Dead. Sadly, on the whole, Chronomaster doesn't seem too motivated to explore the implications of its own setting. The computer databanks are full of wild miracles of science and intergalactic politics, but little is done with them or the core ideas at the heart of the main plot. I was genuinely baffled by Computer Gaming World's praise for Chronomaster's central theme, which Charles R. Dye characterized as being a reflection on the morality of revenge. In my opinion, Chronomaster's treatment of the revenge plot is extremely disappointing. First of all, it has absolutely no significance to René Corder himself, who in this context is a side character in someone else's story. Secondly, it's not clear whether it's meant to be a plot twist or not, as the game treats it as such, but it was spoiled by the contemporary marketing. And thirdly, there's no real tension between Corder and any other character over this issue. Corder extols the virtue of moderation in pursuit of justice, and everyone just goes along with it. I wasn't able to get a copy of the Chronomaster novelization, but the reviews I read seemed to indicate that it's no better in this regard, and actually has the same problem as the game. It introduces interesting concepts as part of the background lore, but doesn't do enough with the ones that are meant to serve as the backbone of its story. It's worth lingering on the novelization for a moment, as one review talked about how much they hated the character of Jester, Corder's AI companion. Apparently, the novelization makes the relationship between Corder and Jester a much greater part of the story, especially Jester's conspicuously feminine possessiveness towards him.
Oh, I could just kiss you.
Hey, don't make so much of it, boss. Remember, she'll kill just about anything.
Despite these negative reviews, I feel like Chronomaster would have benefited from focusing more on Corder and Jester. Aside from a couple of the side plots, the interactions between these two characters are the only place in Chronomaster I found any humour or warmth. The character of Milo, at least as he's portrayed in-game, could easily have been folded into Corder, as he's too bland to really stand on his own merits, and giving his backstory to the protagonist would have given the writers more to work with. Why it was so important to have Milo, I don't know, but I'd speculate it was due to Zelazny's original outline talking about the use of dual scenes. Lindskold and Dreamforge probably had a lot of grand ideas about how to use this concept for storytelling or as a gameplay mechanic, but the end result is a very forgettable gimmick. The same could be said for the whole idea of non-linear storytelling in Chronomaster. Lindskold has admitted that at the time they were very proud of having multiple endings and narrative reactivity in the game, but by modern standards it's nothing special. Chronomaster's narrative reactivity is mostly in the form of game overs or premature endings that make it abundantly clear you did something wrong. In the game's defense, some decisions do carry over between worlds, and these aren't always binary good or bad results. But the most obvious callbacks come in the final Pocket universe, where the game lambasts you for failing to do something right the first time round and warns you that this is your last chance to fix it. It's certainly a lot more reactive than the average adventure game, but to me this kind of reactivity comes dangerously close to being a very elaborate version of an end-of-level score. To summarize, Chronomaster has a lot of potentially interesting ideas hovering in the background, and it doesn't do anything explicitly wrong as far as the storytelling goes. But I didn't come out of Chronomaster feeling particularly moved by any of the character arcs or the philosophical challenges they confronted. Many things about Chronomaster's writing feel like an outline or early draft, a fantastic setup for a story that has yet to be written. Perhaps this would have come to fruition in Linskold's planned sequels to the novelization, but I guess we'll never know. So Chronomaster is a genuinely fascinating piece of work, but it's not something I can recommend to everyone. If Chronomaster were a movie or a novel, I could easily say, hey, at least give it a chance, but as an 8 to 12 hour experience, it's not something you want to force yourself through. And I feel bad for making a film analogy, because Chronomaster is not some sort of interactive movie made by people who resent having to work on video games. Chronomaster might not revolutionize adventure games, but it has a genuine love for its 90s point-and-click progenitors, and players who enjoy these kinds of puzzles are treated to a very diverse range of challenges. For that audience, I think Chronomaster will hit the right spot. But more casual or impatient players could well become bored or frustrated by the time they reach the second or third Pocket universe. I'd like to say it's worth it for the story, but Chronomaster's story is neither sufficiently thought-provoking nor sufficiently well told to be worth enduring the gameplay for. If you're a point-and-click agnostic, Chronomaster is not going to be the game that converts you. If there are aspects of Chronomaster's non-linear storytelling that interest you, I strongly recommend trying out Westwood's 1997 adventure Blade Runner, which is more carefully designed around player choice and narrative reactivity. But I am glad I had the opportunity to play Chronomaster. It's a window into an older style of science fiction and an older style of adventure gaming. It's also from an era in which it seemed like games were still constantly innovating and pushing the boundaries of what the medium was capable of. I know it's a pipe dream, but if Chronomaster were remade today, expanding on mechanics like manipulating time, non-linear progression, and player choice, it would still seem fresh and exciting. Even at the end of his life, Roger Zelazny believed that there was great untapped potential in what could be done with games. Chronomaster might not live up to that vision, but it's a reminder that it's still something worth striving for.
The voice of the sun is deeper than all thunder. Hear it now.